Ambassador Cekuta, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
You've been at the State Department for 40 years, distinguished career, served under many U.S. presidents, and you were U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan as one of your postings. You are currently teaching at the American University, which is based in Washington, D.C., of course. This interview is very timely, I think, and very important for the viewers to hear your views on what's happening in South Caucasus right now. Let's start with the latest news that we have. Earlier this week, we saw some arrests. Russian security services arrested some ethnic Azerbaijanis living in Russia. Two of them died in the security services custody. As a retaliation, or following shortly after that, Azerbaijan arrested Sputnik journalists, accusing them of being the FSB agents, and 4 additional people, so 7 people total. And this, needless to say, complicated Azerbaijan-Russia relations. So tell us what happened and how do you see these events? What does it mean?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and I'm pleased to have this chance to talk a little bit about Azerbaijan, and I think also Azerbaijan as how it fits in a bigger global picture. And I think what you just sort of sketched out, very much sort of puts that in context. Azerbaijan is part of a bigger global picture in dealing with major powers, and not particularly happy powers, e.g. Russia. In terms of what happened this past week, I'm going to be coming at this pretty much from press reports. It looks like the authorities in Yekaterinburg, raided, arrested, first of all, the Safarov brothers, and then other Russian citizens who are of Azerbaijani origin. And the Safarov brothers, unfortunately, died. The conditions under which they died are highly suspicious. And I think it sort of comes back at a basic impression that the Russian authorities do not necessarily handle things in the most professional manner. Too much force is not a good thing, and this may be what we've seen here. Azerbaijanis are upset, angry, and I think what has happened, as you said, the Russian-Azerbaijani relationship has gotten complicated now. It always is complicated, or almost always is complicated. Azerbaijan sits at a very, very critical and complicated spot on the globe. It borders Russia, it borders Iran, it borders Turkey. Hostile, or maybe not as hostile as in the past relations with its immediate neighbor, Armenia. Georgia has its own problems across the Caspian Sea. There are other difficulties. And the other point to remember, Azerbaijan is the only country in the world that borders both Russia and Iran. In terms of what's happened this past week, I think it's an example of what's happened a number of times, which is that the Russians can sometimes get a little too pushy. Maybe there's a better diplomatic term than that, but I think just to be straightforward here, and overplay a hand. Azerbaijan is very focused on keeping its independence. It lost it for a number of years. It wants it. Azerbaijanis are nationalistic. They care about their country. They care about where it is in the world. And they understand that they're in a bad neighborhood. They understand it's complicated. They understand that they need to try to work out these difficult relations. And I'm not sure that this was necessarily appreciated in Moscow. It's in some ways similar to what happened late last year, December 25th, with the crash of the plane, and how that was handled. Azerbaijan, again, President Aliyev not usually sort of make the kinds of statements he did at that time. Shows how,
And it seems like they're still unhappy about how
they're still unhappy, and these things that build on each other. They build on each other, and that may be sort of what we're seeing now. It's unfortunate. I don't know whether the Safarov brothers and the others were involved in this series of killings or not. But at this point, when actions like this happen from a police force, you almost lose you lose the narrative on the possible crime, and they're then focusing on the mistreatment by the police.
Yeah, and what do you make of the fact that Azerbaijani authorities arrested, of all people, Sputnik journalists? And there was a reaction from the Kremlin, of course, on that as well.
The Azerbaijan authorities have a very realistic understanding of who does what and who's who and who is doing what for what ends. Obviously, this was not, I'm sure, a spontaneous decision. I'm sure this was something that was considered in going forward. Certainly here in the United States, we've had concerns about Sputnik RT journalists in terms of what they're doing. It very much does send a message to the Kremlin that Azerbaijanis are angry, that they are concerned about maintaining their sovereignty, about maintaining their independence, and protecting their citizens, which is what this kind of comes. Okay, granted, the Safarov brothers at the time were, and I don't think any of the people arrested actually are currently Azerbaijani citizens, but they're ethnic Azerbaijanis, and so there is a kind of context, there is a kind of connection.
And so beyond this incident or instance of arrests on both sides, do you see the relationship getting even worse between Baku and Moscow?
I don't know if I would say worse. I would say that it could get more complicated. I think President Aliyev is very good at understanding how far things can go and keeping things from going too far. He understands the mood of many of the people in his country. He understands, as we saw actually in December, early January, the anger that Azerbaijanis felt over that plane crash. And frankly, I'm always impressed, by the heroism of the Azal crew and what they did to save so many lives. It's really amazing. But it shouldn't have happened. And when I was in Azerbaijan in March, the sort of temperature had calmed down. People still remembered, but it was not the vociferous anger that we had seen late December, early January. I think that might be, again, what will happen this time. Baku understands it has a very big neighbor to the north. It has a neighbor with ambitions, and it has to be managed. Just as Baku understands it's got a neighbor to the south, it has to be managed. And they have shown themselves, the Azerbaijanis have shown themselves very good at trying to manage this. I mean, the Kazakhs have the great term multi-vector diplomacy. That's not a term that you really hear in Baku, but and President Aliyev, very much notes Azerbaijan as a country sort of Asiatic, European, Christian, Muslim. It bridges certain things, and as the person managing the bridge, he understands he's got to sort of handle both sides of what's on the other sides of those bridges.
How do you view Russia's sort of attitude, policies, presence in Azerbaijan right now? Because there is a sort of thought process or a theory that because of its war in Ukraine, Russia is slowly losing grip on the Caucasus, be it Armenia, Azerbaijan. Georgia is a different case in this case, but what do you think Russia is thinking or Kremlin is thinking as it comes to this, as you say, complicated or more complicated relations with Azerbaijan?
Well, I think, for me, it's sort of when the war really began in 2014 in Ukraine, but when it went into this current all-out phase in 2022, many people said, Russia won't be able to do two things at once. And my attitude was, again, coming as basically prejudices of an American diplomat. Well, you're a great power. You've got to do more than one thing at a time. What we've seen with Russia is that this war has been a drain on Russian assets. It has been a drain on Russian capabilities, on money, on armaments, using tanks from decades ago, for example. If somebody had told me in February or March 2022 that Russia would be looking to North Korea to provide troops, I would have said, huh? But they are. And they've worked with Iran on getting drones. And so that sort of told me that Russia really does not have the capabilities that we maybe thought it did. That said, on my conversations I've had in Azerbaijan, with people coming here, people from Central Asia, Kazakhstan, obviously Georgia, the Baltics, and so forth. Moldova. There is this very prevalent fear of, if Ukraine goes, we are next. So I can talk to I hear this from Azerbaijanis. We're number 2 on the list, but I also hear the same thing in the Baltics, and the same thing from Moldova, Kazakhstan. There is, I would say, Russia cannot be taken for granted. I think it's silly or dangerous maybe is a better word, to think that Russia's totally preoccupied with Ukraine. It is preoccupied with Ukraine, but it still has capabilities to do other things. And what it might do after, and God forbid it actually does win in Ukraine, what it might do to other countries nearby. And I think that's a factor that is in the mindsets of the presidents, the leaderships in the countries that border Russia, that were once part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, do you think because of that Azerbaijan is trying to realign itself closer with Turkey?
Well, I think there's a very, very close relationship with Turkey. I mean, let me back up a little bit. When I was first posted in Baku in 2015, it was the time of the European Games, and I was at the opening ceremony, and the different countries marched in. Biggest cheers from the crowd, spontaneous, were for Azerbaijan, surprise, Turkey, and Russia. And so I think there is still a strong affinity for Russia, but the Russians may be doing things to undercut that affinity, and I think that's really part of the danger here. I think that Turkey is certainly playing a more active diplomatic role in a number of different places, the Middle East as well as Ukraine, and certainly in Central Asia and the Caucasus. There is, of course, the old line and feeling, and this is really heartfelt, I think, by Azerbaijanis, one nation, 2 states when it comes to Turkey. But there are differences, and when you talk to the Azerbaijani leadership, they will note the differences that they have with Turkey. Certainly not so much in the geopolitical sense, but sort of in a cultural sense. Islam is a different form of Islam in Azerbaijan than in Turkey. They sort of more fundamentalist feeling don't really have that in Azerbaijan.
Turkish role was particularly obvious or very visible and tangible in 2023 when Azerbaijan restored its
took back the rest of Karabakh. Yeah.
And there were basically there was some footage that there were certain tanks or certain military equipment flying Turkish flags together with Azerbaijani flags. So Turkey is obviously very interested in making this relationship stronger and bigger. That increases Turkey's influence in the region. But it probably is making Iran very insecure or unhappy about that, especially given the fact that there are so many ethnic Azerbaijanis living in Iran. So what do you think Iran is, so I'm asking you, what is Russia thinking, what's Turkey thinking now? What do you think Iran is thinking about everything that's happening in South Caucasus right now?
Iran has a lot of problems at the moment. That would probably be the diplomatic understatement of the millennium. When I was posted in Baku, we talk about Iran, and there was a wariness on the Azerbaijani side when it came to Iran. Certainly Iran at that point, this would be 2015, 2018, was highly active in the Middle East, supporting the Houthis, Hezbollah, support for Hamas, other things in the Middle East, disruptive force in Central Asia, active in Iraq, but they weren't at that time really pushing things in the Caucasus. But there was a feeling that they could, and there was something to be taken into account. Given what's gone on over the last, October 7th, has had an impact on all sorts of things. And I think that sometimes my old pals in the European Bureau used to sort of forget that Azerbaijan bordered the Middle East Bureau, um, and the Middle East problems bled in. Since October 7th, of course, we've seen the Israelis, fighting Hamas. We've seen what they did to Hezbollah. We've seen what happened in the war, with Iran in recent weeks. But Iran's down but not out. And so there is this question of, okay, where might they strike back next? Just, on a personal note for me, I entered the State Department in '78. My first tour was Yemen. While I was studying Arabic, there were 4 guys in the class next door and the class behind me who were studying Farsi, who went off to Tehran, who got to be guests of the students for 444 days. And so I've sort of seen and have dealt with Iran throughout my career. And so I think as far as, trying to think of what Iran is doing right now, I'm not sure necessarily. I think they may make protest noises. It's hard to sort of speculate on what they may do. I think they've got bigger and more immediate problems with Israel, with the United States, with the whole question of the nuclear program that they've been pursuing. That will probably take up, the bulk of the time. But there's probably somebody else in the bureaucracy in Tehran who's looking at the Caucasus and looking at it. One of the things that's interesting to me is I've listened to some of these conversations since the U.S. bombing of Fordow and other facilities in Iran, and they'll talk about the minorities in Iran, and then somebody said, well, what about the Azerbaijanis? And somebody quipped, well, they're really not a minority. And the supreme leader's mother is apparently Azeri. I've heard various numbers, 30, 35 million Azeris, ethnic, Azerbaijani, who live in Iran. So that's another factor, I think, in terms of Iranian calculations. And when I was ambassador, there was a period of ethnic unrest in northwestern Iran because of some stupid statements that were made on Iranian television, accusations regarding, that were very damning, slamming to ethnic Azeris, and in Tabriz and other places there were violent demonstrations. So I think that probably is a factor, but I think wariness is warranted when it comes. We're sitting in Baku looking at what's going on regarding Iran.
What do you think America's interests are or should be in Azerbaijan? How do you see that?
Well, I think the interests that we've had there, I think can, by and large, continue. First of all, is in Azerbaijan's independence, its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, the security of Azerbaijan, and how that fits in the overall security of the region, both in terms of Europe, in terms of Central Asia, in terms of the Middle East. Baghdad is not that far away from Baku. We tend to forget that sometimes, the European side of things. And Azerbaijan was also a very good partner in a number of ways. I think famously, it sort of says a lot that the Azerbaijani troops were the last to leave Kabul in 2021 with the Americans. They were with us at the airport. And that's something that we Americans need to remember, Azerbaijanis remember. But I think it also says something about Azerbaijan. Certainly we want to see Azerbaijan cooperate more closely with NATO, its forces to be NATO compatible. We look to Azerbaijan as a force against terrorism. It's kind of dropped off the radar screen, but it only takes one incident, and suddenly we'll be back on the front pages of the Times, the Post, and the Journal. And so that relationship is important. We look at Azerbaijan too as being a force for stability in the region, and for that sense, I think finding a real peace, not peaceful, a real peace with Armenia is a critical interest. Certainly, on the economic side, the energy piece remains important. Azerbaijan has been an important contributor to energy security in Europe and globally. Azerbaijani crude being sold to Israel for years, Azerbaijani gas going to Europe, and sort of helping provide a cushion, which really became important in 2022 with the war in Ukraine. And again, something that doesn't always get a lot of attention. A lot of countries in the Balkans and others have come to Azerbaijan looking for additional hydrocarbons. That remains important. And Azerbaijan is also looking at how it can use its wind and solar, sort of moving into a new energy world and so forth. What has, of course, been sort of the real irritant in U.S.-Azerbaijan relationships has been on the human rights side. Now, with this administration, that may be a different situation. But I think that we do have very definite security interests, very definite economic interests, and we regarded Azerbaijan as a strategic partner when I was there, before I was there, and there's good reason for doing so. They bring a lot to the table.
Let's talk a bit more about the peace process or peace agreement, final peace agreement with Armenia. It looks like there are just a couple very big items, but small number of issues that need to be still agreed upon. So how do you see that? What do you anticipate the agreement anytime soon? Where does it stand at this point?
My understanding is I've sort of seen statements saying that basically the peace agreement has been resolved. What I understand, and my own information on this may be wrong, so you can count this as sort of why we need to learn more about the region, is that one of the real issues has been this question about the references in the Armenian constitution to lands that are not in Armenia. And so this question of, is this, we get this agreement signed, but in the back of Armenia's mind, is there still sort of a more aggressive intent? And I know this is something that is under discussion among various diplomats, particularly between the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians. It's something I've heard, Prime Minister Pashinyan talk about in Washington. I've heard this from Azerbaijani friends as well. And I understand the concerns. I will confess to a certain degree of nervousness when anybody says referendum these days, what you may get. I sort of there's a great line from Mike Froman, who used to be the U.S. Trade Representative, but I worked with when he was in the White House when I was at State, and he was talking about trade agreements. And he said, "You got to remember that the other side also has got politics." And I think that this is sometimes it can get lost in some of the discussions that go on in the South Caucasus. There's something that plays to your side, but you got to remember that the other side's also got to kind of deal with these things. In an ideal world, we would see this agreement signed. I think there is a desire to do so. I think Turkey also would like to see this agreement signed. I've heard that from Turkish officials. But that's not the end of the process. Sorry to use that awful word, process. But it is that we're looking at 30 plus years of hostility between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. And I know that I will constantly hear from Azerbaijanis, well, we used to live together great, and people, intermarried, and it didn't really matter if we were Azeri or Armenian. That was then. And we've had decades of children growing up and learning who are now in their 30s, that the other side is the enemy that's going to kill me. And so that's going to take, building that peace is going to be hard, and it's going to require more than just signing an agreement. It's going to require real effort by both sides. It's going to require, I think, help from outside. I would like to see the United States help with that. We have done that in other countries. But as I've said to a number of people a number of times, a great line I was once given by a prime minister in a Balkan country was, why can't we do in Southeastern Europe what was done in Northwestern Europe? I.e., when we look at Northwestern Europe in 1945, 1946, 1947, there was no guarantee there was not going to be another Franco-German war. Now, it's unthinkable. But that was conscious effort. That didn't just kind of happen.
Do you see that kind of effort from the West towards the Caucasus, towards Armenia and Azerbaijan right now?
I think it could come, but it's going to require leadership and it's going to require attention. And I think part of it's probably also going to need probably some requests from both Armenia and Azerbaijan to sort of say, "Hey, help us."
Yeah, and Armenia is in a very difficult situation at the moment.
That's what I also I say
It's
politics. I mean, I've never been to Armenia, so I have to sort of couch it that way. But from all accounts and everything I've read, um, it's not sort of Pashinyan says X and everybody just does it. And so I think again, you watch what you're sort of asking the Armenian side to swallow is important. That said, I mean, we've got to sort of move to this point that both sides say no ambitions on each other's territories. Your territory is what it is. It's sovereign. It's yours. You're independent. We're staying out of this, and everybody has to respect that. And, that's an important basis, really, for the post World War II peace.
The region Azerbaijan and Armenia have never been closer to lasting peace than now. It's never been accomplished, at least since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And that potentially opens up opportunities for both of them. Maybe more so for Azerbaijan than for Armenia. So let's talk about the Zangezur corridor for a second. If you would just explain to the viewers what it is and why are we talking about this now?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've just known what I've seen in the press on this. So we'll work on that. But I'll back up a little bit here. The reality for Azerbaijan is that an important piece of it, Nakhchivan, is physically separated. I think it's 40 kilometers of Armenian territory. Armenia goes down to the Iranian border and then blocks road surface access from what we refer to as mainland Azerbaijan, from Nakhchivan. Now, the question has been, and it's been talked about in different ways. They've talked about this as a corridor, which for the Armenian side and for others, conjures up images. The only corridor anybody remembers was Danzig in 1939, which was used by the Nazis as a pretense, to go to war with Poland and really kick off World War II. So there's a certain nervousness about that. And at the same time, the Azerbaijanis don't want the Armenian side to suddenly stop traffic between Nakhchivan and mainland Azerbaijan, either road traffic or rail traffic. There is a rail line that's there from Soviet times, possibly before. So there are ways, Azerbaijan for years has had agreements with Iran where trucks could go into Iran and they would sort of coast along the south side of the Araz River and then go back up into Nakhchivan. That again, sort of depended on Iranian goodwill on certain days, which is one reason why the Azerbaijanis are also nervous. Another factor, coming back to the question of Azerbaijani-Iranian relations. I think where the world is today, there are examples where you could find ways to be able to move traffic through that would not be interrupted. And certainly in terms of electronic controls on things, keeping track of who's gone what where. I mean, I'm actually thinking about this just now. Even in the bad old days of the Cold War, there were corridors out of Berlin to Bavaria, to Hamburg, to West Germany, that went through the DDR, that went through East Germany, and the traffic proceeded. And yes, there was a time, the infamous Berlin airlift, the Berlin blockade, which produced the Berlin airlift, so stopped that. But generally, it worked, and I think there are ways like that could be done. That you don't have to get into. You can continue to recognize Armenian sovereignty over the southern part of Armenia that borders onto Iran. That the trade across. But I think you can do. There are ways of doing this. It's going to require.
That's the biggest concern that Armenians have. It's connected to their sovereignty. It's a major issue.
Yeah, and again, the Azerbaijanis are concerned about their sovereignty. So we've got sort of both sides with the same set of concerns. So are there ways that this can be done? And I think again, in where we are now in entering into the second quarter of the 21st century, there are lots of ways that we have developed in recent years for controlling traffic that don't require the kinds of intrusive controls that were needed years ago. And I think that some of that we could use that in those technologies to enable transit back and forth
What would
between.
be the strategic? What would be the strategic implication of having this corridor up and
Well,
running?
actually, that's an important point because it's the corridor itself. I mean, we talk a lot about the middle corridor, which is this idea of, I mean, the new Silk Road, whatever you want to call it, even the BRI, connecting China with Europe again, overland. If you look at the old maps, it looks kind of like there was one road, but it actually wasn't. As I sort of joke that you got on in Xi'an and got off in Venice. It was a network of roads, a network of cities, and I think this could be part of that. There is certainly that already existing in terms of the new rail connections that go from Alat across Azerbaijan to Georgia and then into Turkey and so forth to the west, or the other way going east. Across the Caspian. I think it would be, flesh out that route. It would flesh out a new ability to grow more trade, more economic connections. I heard a program the other day, the IMF talking about one of the biggest problems for the South Caucasus and Central Asia is the lack of trade among the countries. This would be a way of sort of facilitating that. I think, too, what it would do is bring Armenia more into the mix. Armenia, to my mind, sort of self-isolated from the rest of the region during all the years of the Karabakh conflict. And so what this would do is kind of bring Armenia into this central middle corridor process and build up connections with its neighbors and increase prosperity in Armenia. I think, building trade between Armenia and Turkey is very important. I think this would be part of the way of doing that. It's in
What do you
everybody's
think
interest.
this will do to Georgia? Georgia is also very
Georgia, well, for Georgia right now is the sort
currently.
of that's the sort of the route right now is going across Azerbaijan and Georgia and through. I think there's room for more than one road. The And I think again, sort of more connectivity can bring more economic interactivity and more prosperity to everybody.
There is some concern among some in Georgia that this may diminish Georgia's role as a strategic sort of hub for the region. What's your view on that?
I don't think it necessarily does, and I think again I want to come back to this point that the Silk Road wasn't this Jersey Turnpike across Asia. When you even think about the Jersey Turnpike, there are a lot of towns along the way, a lot of businesses along the way, and frankly, the Turnpike has facilitated growth. And I think as a New Yorker quoting New Jersey is probably sort of a scary concept to any American, but the idea is that by increasing the economic connectivity, by increasing the interaction among people, companies in that region, no matter which side of which border they're sitting on, it's going to increase prosperity for everybody. And so I think there's a lot of potential, a lot of creativity in Georgia, there's a lot in Armenia, there's a lot in Azerbaijan. Getting these groups together, letting them interact, letting them build off each other is going to benefit everybody. I think right now we still have this idea of if my neighbor gets something, I'm going to lose. It doesn't need to be like that. And I will come back to my rather strange example of I-95 in the United States, the interstate highway, and how that has facilitated connections among all sorts of towns that didn't have those connections before, facilitated economic growth and increased people's prosperity.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, Ambassador Cekuta, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts and your insights into giving some context to everything that's happening in that small but very, very complicated region. I appreciate your time.
No, it's an important part of the world, and governments, other countries, including my own, often need to remember that. So thank you very much for the opportunity.